Failed experiment. Never videotape yourself when you sleep. Sleep is supposed to be our sanctuary, a time when our bodies recharge and our minds drift into dreams, a safe harbor from the waking world. But what if sleep is not as peaceful as we think? What if, during those hours of vulnerability, something lurks in the shadows of our unconsciousness, unseen and unknown, manipulating us in ways we can't even begin to comprehend? In Never Videotape Yourself When You Sleep, we dive into this chilling mystery through the eyes of Mark, a man whose innocent curiosity leads him into the darkest corners of human vulnerability. By setting up a camera to observe himself during sleep, he unwittingly opens a door to something far more sinister. What begins as a simple experiment quickly descends into a waking nightmare, where the boundary between dream and reality blurs, and the terrifying truth of what happens when we close our eyes is revealed. This story is a cautionary tale for anyone who has ever wondered what really happens while they sleep. As Mark's nights unravel into a world of grotesque horrors and sleepless dread, the real question becomes, can you ever truly feel safe when you sleep? Mark had always been fascinated by the mysteries of the human body. He would spend hours reading articles about sleep patterns, brain waves, and the various stages of sleep. There was something inherently eerie yet intriguing about the fact that, for roughly a third of our lives, we are unconscious, vulnerable, unaware of what is happening around us. What if something was happening while we slept? Something we couldn't remember, something we couldn't explain. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He had read about people who videotaped themselves sleeping to catch the odd movements or sounds they made during the night. Some had reported laughing in their sleep, others talking. There were even instances where people caught themselves sleepwalking. The idea thrilled and unsettled him in equal measure. Could there be more to sleep than just rest? What if there was a deeper, darker secret behind those hours of unconsciousness? Determined to find out, Mark set up his camera on a tripod, pointing it directly at his bed. The red recording light flickered on, and with a sense of anticipation, he crawled under the covers. He felt a bit foolish as he lay there, staring up at the ceiling. This is stupid, he thought to himself, but soon, the steady hum of the camera faded from his awareness, and he drifted into a deep sleep. Morning came too soon. Sunlight poured through the curtains, spilling warmth into the room, but Mark didn't feel rested. His head was heavy, his body sluggish, as if he hadn't really slept at all. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Rubbing his eyes, he sat up and remembered the camera. For a moment, he hesitated, a cold dread creeping up his spine. His hand hovered over the stop button, and he shook his head, laughing nervously to himself. "Get a grip," he muttered. He clicked the button and rewound the footage. The first couple of hours were unremarkable. The soft sound of his breathing filled the room, accompanied by the occasional rustle of blankets as he shifted from side to side. He fast-forwarded through long stretches where nothing much happened. But then, just around 2:34 a.m., something on the screen made him pause. His body was lying perfectly still on the bed, almost too still. His face was visible, illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight leaking through the blinds. His eyes were wide open. Mark blinked, confused. "Was I awake?" he asked aloud. He watched intently as the figure on the screen remained motionless, eyes staring up at the ceiling. Slowly, unnervingly, his head turned to the side, but his eyes remained fixated upward, rolling back into his skull. The whites of his eyes gleamed in the low light, making his face look hollow and inhuman. The next movement was subtle but horrifying. His mouth slowly fell open, but it wasn't just the act of opening that sent a wave of nausea through him. It was the way his jaw unhinged unnaturally, sliding to the side, as though something was prying it open. His mouth stretched wider and wider until it was grotesque, far beyond what should have been physically possible. His lips trembled, and a faint, gurgling noise echoed from the video. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he leaned closer to the screen, his breath shallow. His own face on the video was twisted into something nightmarish. The hands that had been resting calmly on his chest were now raised, fingers splayed out as though reaching for something that wasn't there. They hovered in the air for a moment, twitching and curling as though being manipulated by invisible strings. Then, as quickly as it began, the strange episode ended. His jaw snapped shut with an audible click that made Mark wince. His hands dropped back onto the bed, and his eyes fluttered shut as if nothing had happened. His breathing slowed to its normal rhythm, and he continued to sleep peacefully for the rest of the night. Mark sat back in his chair, trembling. What had he just watched? His first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe it was sleep paralysis, he thought, or a vivid nightmare. He had read about people doing strange things in their sleep, but this felt different. It felt wrong. It felt sinister. The more he tried to console himself, the less sense it made. How could he be awake, his eyes open like that, and yet not remember any of it? How could his jaw move in such an unnatural way, like some grotesque puppet? No dream could explain that. As the day wore on, the unsettling images replayed in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see his own face, distorted and alien. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every time he started to drift off, he jerked awake, terrified that he might find himself doing it again, whatever it was. The next few nights were worse. He would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close his eyes, too scared of what he might see if he set up the camera again. Sleep became a distant memory. The exhaustion gnawed at him, making him irritable, paranoid. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the soft tick of the clock on the wall. His insomnia worsened, and with it came strange, fleeting visions. Shadows in the corners of his room seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would hear the faintest sound of gurgling, like the one he had heard on the tape, echoing through the silence. A week passed, and Mark was a shell of his former self. His eyes were sunken, his hands shook, and he had stopped going to work, afraid to leave the safety of his home. He had considered destroying the camera, but something stopped him. Some morbid curiosity, a need to understand what had happened that night. Then, one evening, when he was on the brink of collapse from sheer exhaustion, he decided to look at the tape one last time. Perhaps if he watched it again, he'd see something he had missed, something that could explain it all. He fast-forwarded through the mundane moments until he reached the part that had haunted him so deeply. But this time, as he watched, something was different, something even more terrifying. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, a shadow moved. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor was it a glitch in the camera. Something, or someone, had been in the room with him that night. The shadow grew larger, creeping closer to the bed until it hovered just over his sleeping form. And then, in the dim glow of the night, Mark saw it. A hand, dark and twisted, reached down toward his mouth, its fingers long and skeletal. The hand grasped his jaw and forced it open, pulling it to the side. The camera flickered, and the shadow vanished, but the damage had been done. Mark slammed the laptop shut, his chest heaving with panic. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just seen. It wasn't him. Something else had been controlling his body that night. Something that had slipped into his room unnoticed. Something that had invaded his sleep. He never slept again. The camera was gone. Mark had smashed it to pieces the moment he saw the shadowy hand force his jaw open. But destroying the camera didn't destroy the memories. The horrific image of that twisted hand stayed with him, haunting his waking moments and plaguing his sleepless nights. Days blurred into nights as his insomnia tightened its grip, turning his mind into a battlefield between exhaustion and fear. Mark knew he had to escape, to leave his apartment, to get away from whatever malevolent force had taken root in his life. But every time he tried, something stopped him. A creeping dread, an invisible weight, held him down. It was as if the thing in the darkness wasn't finished with him yet. One evening, when the walls of his home felt like they were closing in, Mark made a desperate decision. He would leave. He didn't know where, but anywhere would be better than this place. He stuffed some clothes into a bag, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. But as his hand reached for the knob, a low gurgling sound echoed through the room, the same noise he had heard on the tape. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was closer now, more distinct, like it was coming from inside him. His hand trembled as he slowly turned around. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, he saw something that nearly stopped his heart. His own face, pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, stared back at him. But it wasn't his face. The skin sagged unnaturally, his jaw slackened and twisted at an odd angle, the same grotesque contortion he had seen in the video. And behind him, in the dim light, was a shadow, darker than the deepest night, creeping closer. Mark tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The shadow reached him, wrapping around his body like smoke, suffocating him in its cold grip. His legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the weight of it pressed down on him. In his final moments, Mark understood. The entity hadn't come from the outside. It had always been with him, feeding on his curiosity, his fears, growing stronger each sleepless night. By recording himself, he had summoned it fully into his reality. The camera had been a window, but now the window was open, and there was no closing it. As his vision blurred and the darkness overtook him, the last sound he heard was a soft click, like the flicker of a camera recording. Then, silence. Mark's body was found days later, slumped on the floor, his face twisted in a frozen scream, his jaw unnaturally displaced. The cause of death was listed as unknown, and the police found no sign of foul play. But there was one thing they couldn't explain. The camera, the one Mark had destroyed, smashed to bits, lay on the floor beside him, perfectly intact. And the red recording light was on.